Introduction, Peter, and I guess as a background, I grew up on a cattle station in the Kimberley, Beverly Springs Station, now called Charney River Station. And so I lived up there for 15 years, growing up as a young boy, and that's where I developed a passion for plants. And I guess that's a passion which develops particularly in high school and has gone on ever since then. And so this is one of the landscapes just north of the station that I grew up on. This is in the Prince Regent River area, which is one of the highest elevation areas of the Kimberley. And also it's actually the second oldest landscape in Australia. So that's just something to keep in mind. And these fantastic dissected sandstone landscapes is where we've done a lot of our work in the Kimberley. So let's figure out the zoom control. And this one's okay, so it's slightly different control on zoom for the PowerPoint. Okay, so I guess a lot of people, if they go up to the Kimberley at all, see it in the dry season. So this is the Mitchell Falls on the right in the dry season and on the left in the wet season. And just the appearance of the landscape is dramatically different between those two seasons. It's such a defining feature of the area. And the wet season can be quite brief. It can be only 3 months of the year. And so there's a very long, prolonged dry period. And that really drives a lot of the diversity and patterns of the flora. So the geology of the Kimberley is fairly complex, but it's dominated by this giant sandstone plateau in the North Kimberley, which is the brown on this slide, with quite a lot of variation around the edges of the Kimberley, including the well-known features such as the Napier Range, the Devonian limestone reef, and a very interesting area down in the Broome areas, the Pindan sands, which are actually a desert sand blown in that has now a tropical flora sort of overlaying over the top of these desert sands. And I'll come back to those. When we think about, I guess, impact on a landscape, our first thought is vegetation cover. And so if we look at the Kimberley region, vegetation cover, with very few small exceptions, is essentially intact from a cover point of view. But in that sense, if we compare that to, say, agriculture regions where a lot of the landscape's being cleared, it's very obvious that the landscape itself is highly degraded. The Kimberley is thought of as a pristine wilderness by many, and vegetation cover would suggest that. In terms of rainfall, it's one of the higher rainfall areas of Australia, and particularly the northwest Kimberley. There's areas where we know the rainfall is above 1,400 millimetres per year, but there's actually no rain gauges in the area, so we don't know how much above that. We suspect the highest point is probably around 1,600 mils average rainfall, but that's probably only a small area. So the Kimberley itself, very famous for its summer thunderstorms and lightning shows, incredibly spectacular, incredibly powerful. And actually on an Australian scale and on global scale, this is a map of lightning flashes in intensity. The Kimberley is actually the highest density of anywhere in Australia for lightning strikes, and it's actually on par as the highest in the world. So the only other place in the world that compares for lightning intensity, which is a reflection of the intensity of storms, is the Pantapuri highlands of Venezuela. So it's quite unique in that sense, and it's just one of the remarkable features. So that's why the light shows are so good in Kimberley. I guess now we come back to some of the, I guess, less obvious factors when you talk about vegetation cover being essentially intact. When we start to look at the fire frequency, and fire is obviously a very contentious issue locally here in the Sydney area and also in the Kimberley region. And as areas of sandstone, there are actually numerous similarities between the floras. And that's one of the things that drew me to Sydney, was to understanding that what those commonalities are in the sandstone floras, particularly some of the things which go from the Kimberley down to Sydney and stop on the Sydney sandstones. And frequency of fire and the impact of fires on that vegetation is an important factor. And so I guess the key thing here is to see how much of the Kimberley here is red, saying they've had more than 11 or more fires in the last over 15-year period. And so that's 2 years out of 3, those areas are getting burnt. And so it's a third of the Kimberley is burnt every single year. and clearly that's not sustainable. Fire return frequencies probably should be in the order of 1 in 15 years. And so clearly we're a long way off that at the moment. And so one of the key things there is this vegetation I mentioned earlier on the desert sands around between Broome and Derby and out to Fitzroy Crossing, the Pindan. It's a very unique vegetation. It's been described variously as the world's driest rainforest or the world's wettest desert. And from the point of view of the structure, the vegetation, and the soils it's on, I would describe it as the world's wettest desert. So it's a desert with a low forest on it. But that makes it very, very sensitive to fire. And this illustration here at the RAAF base near Derby shows frequent fire on the right and fire exclusion around the RAF base on the left, and just how different the vegetation can become very, very quickly. So the entire Pindan area, which is a massive area covering the entire peninsula, I believe is now a threatened ecosystem. So in terms of conservation reserves, there's a number of quite large reserves scattered around the Kimberley, but given the diversity of the Kimberley landscape, it's still not really capturing the great diversity of plants that are there. And so in terms of how the Kimberley fits in the scale of Western Australia as a biodiverse ecosystem and landscape, obviously everyone thinks about the southwest for its biodiversity down there, but the Kimberley is actually very rich itself. And so the earliest estimates when Bentham published his Flora Australiensis in the 1860s, 70s, he thought he only recorded about 400 species we now know for the Kimberley. There were very few collections from the area. The collections of Alan Cunningham and a few others were available to him. But that number slowly crept up to the point where they wrote a Flora of the Kimberley region, published in 1992, with just over 2,000 species included. But with further work, and particularly getting into remote areas in the wet season, that number's actually increased really rapidly since then, to the point that the last time I added up our figures in 2016, we had over 3,300, and I suspect we've got around 3,800 species in the Kimberley region, just based on our projection. Our species discovery curve hasn't really slowed yet, and so our estimates are kind of based on the areas we're yet to explore. If we look at what the dominants are in that vegetation in terms of the number of species, the wattles are very strong, but so are the sedges and the grasses, and then a lot of herbs, the trigger plants, heliotropes, the poison peas, things like gardenia. But it's interesting to note that Corymbia and Eucalyptus, even as separate genera, they're actually a hotspot of diversity up in the Kimberley, particularly for Corymbia. There were 39 species each. Other things like hibiscus and Dricularia are also very high, and bush tomatoes are very high. There's a lot of undescribed species in the bush tomatoes, and that's likely to go up in the list. In terms of families, peas, grasses and mallows are very high, and also the Cyperaceae and Myrtaceae, and then a bunch of other things. But there's quite a few herbaceous species that are very prolific up there. In terms of how well we actually know the landscape and the diversity of the Kimberley, back in 2006, sort of the data started to become publicly available on numbers of collections, where they were from, and we were able to draw this map, which basically showed 2 red squares and 1 orange square as places with higher density of collection than others. But even the highest number of collections there, 1,000 collections in that grid square for around Kununurra, species numbers. That reflects the fact that it is around Kununurra and there are people in the town collecting. The other red square is the Mitchell Plateau, and then the orange square was the station we grew up on, and that's largely our collections that my brother and I made growing up. And then there's a not quite as bright square there, just over 500 species around Broome. And so it's really reflecting just a couple of centres where people have actually made some effort in collecting. And really, I wouldn't even consider those 3 squares to be well collected. So I would actually consider the entire Kimberley to be very underrepresented in our biodiversity surveys. If we come forward to 2017, I've reworked those figures, and now we're looking at the number of species and mapped against the number of records. That large large density around Kununurra. The number of species recorded in that Kununurra area has now more than doubled to over 2,000 species. So a higher number that were known for the entire Kimberley region in 1992 are now known for just that square around Kununurra. And interestingly, we're getting higher numbers come in as my brother and I's collections have come in from the Prince Regent area in particular. Now we're looking at 1,500, 1,600 known species across the Prince Regent, Mitchell Plateau areas. And those numbers are still, those areas still poorly collected, and those numbers are only going to go up. And we think that Northwest Kimberley is going to be the highest diversity in the Kimberley. So translating that into endemism, previous estimates were at less than 10% endemism for the Kimberley. It was thought that a lot of the tropical savanna flora was quite widespread, and there wasn't necessarily that high a rate of endemism in the Kimberley. But we're currently at 22% of the species are thought to be endemic, and many of the new species we're discovering are also endemic and localized endemic. So the species we don't know about are the endemic and rare species, and from a conservation perspective, these are the most important ones. And so we really need more information, and particularly our sampling gaps, to understand reserve planning, conservation status of these species. And so we're really still just scratching the surface of the Kimberley diversity. And so over a period of many years now, so I think it's now around 25 years, I've been working on a new set of keys. So since the Flora of the Kimberley region was published, so I now have keys to over 3,500 taxa from the area. It's gone through the history of the names and bibliographic information so people can look up references where there's no ready flora. And importantly, it includes 364 taxa which are still unnamed. So they've given phrase names or tag names so that people can refer to them, but we don't know yet enough about them to name them, or we haven't had time to write them up and name them. So now to get onto the Kimberley landscape and the actual species, this is how a lot of the people see the Kimberley as they arrive through the Napier Range, Queen Victoria Head here. They drive up in the dry season when the roads open, they're mostly dirt roads. The grass is drying off, and a lot of people think of the Kimberley as a desert because they go around the southern Kimberley or the Gibb River Road when the grass is dry, and it does look quite arid. The green areas are restricted to riparian vegetation along the larger creeks and rivers, and the landscape, particularly if it's been burnt, really can look like a desert. But to really get an appreciation for the landscape, you need to get up in the air. And so most of our work we do in helicopters. And so there's very few roads around the areas, and a lot of the I guess, less explored areas you can only access by helicopter, or some of the areas by boat around the coast. And so there's plenty of challenges with collecting plants in the Kimberley. The conditions, the seasonality, even just drying your plants can be a major challenge. And so stopping your specimens going out if you're out camp, but essentially camping for 10 days, you've got no power, there's nowhere to dry the plants other than continually change newspaper, and that gets wet just from the humidity. But the landscapes themselves are incredible, the diversity is amazing, and particularly with a helicopter, you just can get in some of the most incredible landscapes in Australia. And this is a spot we've been back to a number of times where we actually land the helicopter on a waterfall halfway up this cliff on the side of a mesa rainforest above us, this waterfall, rainforest below, the waterfall above us. But one day we landed in there and a massive storm came up above the waterfall where we couldn't see it, and suddenly started pelting with rain, and we had to make a hasty retreat before the helicopter got washed off the waterfall. So it's not without its challenges. And getting to the plants can also be a challenge in such a landscape. So here are two species that only grow on cliff faces. So a Trodia that I named on the right, and Kunzia on the left, which has only recently been named and wasn't thought to occur in Western Australia until we actually spotted it growing on these vertical cliff faces just near Lake Argyle. It turned out the Argyle diamond mine's actually taken out some of the plants with the population spreading around from there. But because it was on the cliff faces, no one ever noticed it was there. And when you see the size of some of these faces, if plants are specialised in these locations, it's very difficult to get to them. So the landscape itself is quite varied. The mesas, some of the floodplains created around Kununurra, a lot of our work has been done in these highly dissected landscapes of the Prince Regent. This is Mount Agnes, one of the locations visited by Charles Gardner on some of the early expeditions back in 1919. Gardner went through and collected some of the grevilleas that Peter's worked on and named some of those, things like latifolia. And this is the Walcott Inlet on the left, which was the corner of a station we grew up on, and the Prince Regent on the right. And the Prince Regent is dead straight and tidal for a long way inland because it's formed along a fault line. And it's quite a major fault line in the Kimberley. And the Kimberley, in terms of a landscape and climate, the news forecast is inevitably scattered showers and thunderstorms, or isolated thunderstorms. And it's not until you actually see these thunderstorms you just realise how isolated they are. You can see this storm here absolutely dumping rain, probably dumping a couple of inches of rainfall, but the actual band of rain was only about 1.5 kilometres across. It came up the valley and gave us a soaking after that one, but they're quite incredible for their intensity, but also localisation. So a lot of the work we do in these dissected landscapes is challenging, even just to find a spot where we can land a helicopter to set down. But these dissected landscapes are very important because they give a natural fire protection to a lot of species. So if you can get into these places, we're finding a lot of shrubs that are very fire sensitive and very localised, that highly likely were far more widespread. And we've got a little bit of evidence to suggest they were widespread, but that's a bit speculative because the region's so poorly collected. We have very little baseline data. It's an area just near Kununurra, which has got a population of callistemon, and callistemon is one of those things which has only turned up recently in the Kimberley, but we've now got a couple of disjunct populations and they're still being investigated. There could be new species. Another area which turned out to be more interesting than we thought was some of these coastal islands. These coastal islands aren't separated by great distances from the mainland. The seas between them are very shallow. They were connected to the mainland within the last 10,000 years. And so we didn't really expect to find endemics on them. But particularly this group here, the Barrett Island group, these actually have lateritic caps like the Mitchell Plateau, but they're well disjunct from the Mitchell Plateau. And so when we look at the geology, this geology has actually been isolated for far longer than the landscape has by the rising sea levels. And so when we actually went out there and spent 3 months over the course of a year working on these islands, we actually found a whole bunch of endemics on these islands. So they turned out to be far more interesting than I'd actually anticipated. So I'll just give you a few of the iconic animals of the Kimberley, just to whet your appetite if you haven't been up there. This is the snake they should have used for the movie Anaconda because it's actually got the teeth to match. This is the rough-scaled rock python, initially called the rock python, now just the rough-scaled python because it lives in trees once they got to know its ecology more. And it's got incredibly long teeth, and we actually think it lives in the trees and catches bats, hence the long teeth for grabbing bats as they're flying past. It moves incredibly quickly and very responding here to the heat of a flash. Lots of frogs up there have been involved in the discovery of 4 new frog species, and there's still new frogs and new geckos and skinks turning up. Insect life up there is virtually unknown, just incredible abundance of insect life, and incredibly beautiful things. So anyone who's looking for a few more careers, there's plenty up there. The landscape itself, the waterfalls in the Kimberley are just truly spectacular. And so this is one of the landscapes where we spent a lot of time trying to get into these secluded locations. This is Pitta Gorge. It took us about 10 years to figure out a way to get down to the bottom of the gorge, but eventually got in there and turned up a bunch of interesting things. We get down there and it's this forest of a native nutmeg, Myristica insipida, just incredible. And one of the factors here is it's in this gorge, which is 300 metres deep. The rainfall on top is only there for 3 months of the year, but it seeps into the sandstone and out the bottom of the sandstone into this gorge. So the gorge down the bottom is permanently wet. And so it supports rainforest without rainfall. So it's quite a unique environment. And so, as Peter said, this is Butch, the chopper pilot we tend to use whenever he's available. And often we can land where the new species are. So on a number of occasions, we spotted new species from the helicopter before we even touched down on the ground. But it's great to be able to just go, okay, that looks like a good spot, set down and just go exploring. And it's often we don't get more than a few hundred meters from the helicopter, just because there's so much diversity in these unique sites.